His name is Mark Weaver. He is a constitutional specialist. He teaches Constitution law. He's taught at The Ohio State University up in Columbus, Ohio. That's where I was born and raised. He also has taught at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in the School of Government. He teaches Constitution law. He knows it. He understands it. He's a specialist in it. He's also written several books. One of them is called A Wordsmith's Work. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. If you're looking for a great book to read, check it out on Amazon. It's called A Wordsmith's Work. And today, he penned an op-ed for Newsweek magazine on the Supreme Court ruling from today. You'll see that in today's edition of this week's edition of Newsweek magazine. Tonight, you can talk to him right here, right now, if you have any questions or comments for Mark, by dialing in 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. And my name is Jeff. It's Westside Jeff sitting in for Chris Kroc. So the Supreme Court on Friday, this is another big news story that kind of is flying under the radar because of all the other big news stories, but this one's really important because it applies to us, our lives, and it's government overreach. I want Mark to address this. On Friday, the Supreme Court made a ruling on what is called the Chevron deference case. And for those who don't understand it and why the Supreme Court ended it, the long and short of it is this. Because of a ruling in 1984 in the Chevron decision, the Supreme Court decided at that time that regulatory agencies, they were the experts in their field and that courts should just defer to the interpretation of the law. Here's how that's played out. What that did is that put bureaucrats in charge of the country. Examples. It's how OSHA was able to decide that everyone who worked for a large company had to get the jab, they had to get the COVID vaccine or be fired. That was part of that ruling. It's also how the ATF has been able to decide a piece of plastic is a machine gun. It's how out-of-control agencies have been able to create rules out of thin air and force you and I to comply to those, and the courts had simply to defer to them because, quote-unquote, those were the experts. In this administration, this presidential administration, President Joe Biden's administration, for example, has issued a host of new regulations on the environment. There's a surprise, and other priorities, including restrictions on emissions from power plants and vehicle tailpipes, and rules on student loan forgiveness and overtime pay and affordable housing. Those are some of the things that the Biden administration has ruled on, and they've done that based off of the Chevron deference case, and the Supreme Court on Friday made a ruling and decided to change that. Mark, talk a little bit about that, please.
This comes down to what do you do when Congress isn't clear what it meant when it passed the law? And under the Chevron case, the court had said, well, let the bureaucrats, let their policy choices prevail. Well, bureaucrats, of course, are not elected to anything. They tend to be very homogenous. They tend to live in Washington, D.C. and be of a certain group of folks. They're very similar to one another. And over the years, critics have said, hold it, how can unelected people in big office buildings in Washington, D.C. get to make policy decisions that affect so many Americans? That can't be right. And the court last week agreed and struck down the 1984 Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council case. And we no longer have what's called Chevron deference, meaning deference to what bureaucrats think the law should be. We elect Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. We give them all the legislative power of the Republic, and they get to decide policy. And if we don't like it, we could toss them out every 2 years. You can't toss out bureaucrats, and that's why the court, 6-3, struck down Chevron deference to bureaucrats.
And what happens moving forward now? Instead of the bureaucrats making those decisions, where does that come into play? Explain how that plays out.
Well, when bureaucrats pass regulations that say, listen, we think the regulation ought to be like this, somebody who sues the whichever agency put forth the regulation because they're unhappy with how they're enforcing that regulation. No longer can the lawyers for the bureaucrats, which is the Justice Department, say, well, no, this was a good policy choice made by the bureaucrats. Now people who sue over these regulations will have the wind at their back saying, you can't enforce that reg. Congress didn't say that. If you want that to be the policy outcome, go to Congress and have them say that, but you can't make that a policy outcome. So litigants will have the wind at their back in these fights over whether regulations, in many cases, regulations that hurt businesses. This case arose from a fishing case where the bureaucrats had written a rule that if you're a herring fisherman, you had to pay the cost of inspectors to come and check out to make sure your boat is keeping track of all the herring you're catching. And you got to pay that inspector $710 a day. That was not passed by Congress. That was dreamt up by bureaucrats in Washington. And now, under this ruling, policies like that will not stand unless Congress passes them.
Mark, let's roll back the clock a couple years and let's hypothetically say that the Chevron deference case had passed, the Supreme Court had ruled on it, call it 4 years ago, prior to COVID. We went through a time frame where people really got angry and pissed off at government, is when the government came out and said, if you're a large company, a large employer, you can be fired for not taking the jab. There are many folks I know who lost their jobs, their careers, because they felt very strongly about not getting COVID vaccines. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. I took it. I have no problem with it. But for those friends of mine who said, no, I don't like it, I don't trust it, I don't believe in it, it's not going to kill me, I'm not endangering anybody. If I get it, I get it, and let the cards fall as they may. Those folks who lost their jobs, if the Chevron case had been overturned, what might that have looked like then?
Well, to the extent that it was federal government agencies advancing these policies, had this case been ruled on 4 years ago, litigants would have had more power to push back against those policies. Now, in many cases, it was private companies, state governments, city governments that were advancing these mandates. But to the extent they were done by federal agencies, the bureaucrats would have had much less power behind their policies if Chevron deference had been struck down 4 years ago.
So what this does is shift power towards the judicial bench, correct? Am I right on that, as opposed to the bureaucracies?
No, it shifts power back to Congress. That's what's so fascinating about this last week of Supreme Court jurisprudence. It really was a great week for separation of powers. In the Trump immunity case, power is shifting back to the presidency, allowing a president to make decisions without having ankle biting by the legislative branch and the judicial branch. And in this case, this Loper case about Chevron deference, it's shifting power back to Congress and reminding everybody that when you want a policy outcome, don't go to your friendly neighborhood bureaucrat and ask him or her to write a policy. Go to your member of Congress and have them pass it as a law. If you can get majorities in both houses and then get the president to sign it, you got yourself a law.
That's Mark Weaver. I'm Westside Jeff, sitting in for Chris Kroc. Mark is available for questions. If you have questions for him about the Supreme Court rulings last week and this week, about what's going on in the Joe Biden presidency and the post-debate issues with Trump, the latest ruling from the Supreme Court about that started here in Texas with regard to social media. Steve Bannon reporting to prison today. That's political persecution. Mark used to work in the Department of Justice and is just as angry about that being weaponized as you and I are. Mark, on the other side of this, I got to hit a quick break on the other side of this. I want to get in another topic if somebody wants to talk about that too. And that is, earlier today, the U.S. military heightened the security alert across European bases. So the threat has been increased. There's a bunch of reasons why. I'll give you my thoughts on it, and then I want to hear yours, Mark. If you want to weigh in, 800-288-9227. It's 888-288-WBAP. I'm Westside Jeff, and for Chris Crock on News Talk 820 WBAP, and now on FM at 93.3. A lot of news going on, starting with last Thursday night and the fallout from that, and then over the weekend, and then today. The Supreme Court's been in session. They've made several rulings. I caught a story today, late this afternoon, that caught my eye, and I've just been processing it through the day. My name's Jeff. It's Westside Jeff, and for Chris Crock. Chris is back next Monday. Joining me is Mark Weaver. Mark is a former spokesman for the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. Worked in the Reagan administration. I got to have you tell the Reagan story, by the way. You mind telling your Reagan story? I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I've got two of them. One of them is recounted in my book, A Wordsmith's Work. So I was an appointee of Ronald Reagan at the Justice Department. He never met me. I was, in my 20s, pretty low level. Still a White House appointment, but it wasn't like he interviewed me for the job. So I served my time for him and was very proud. I got a letter from him when I left. I never thought I'd meet him. A couple of years later, I was living in D.C., and as a media consultant and an attorney, I was asked to direct a television program for a great charity called the Horatio Alger Association. And when they hired me, they said, we have many famous members who we've honored. Is there anyone you'd like to have them host the show? Carol Burnett, Bob Hope, Oprah, all these people. And Reagan was on the list, and I said, boy, if you could get Reagan to do it, that'd be quite a thing. So I wrote a script. We sent it out to Reagan. He is no longer president. He was living in California. He agreed to do it. I flew out and spent, the morning, 3 or 4 hours, directing him in what was likely his final television appearance before he went into seclusion. And it was just a wonderful time. I wasn't anybody important to him, but he was kind and he was humble. He was funny. All the things you'd like to think about a guy. But I'm here to tell you, I was just right up close with him. At one point, I was so nervous, I said to him, now, Mr. President, when I say action, that means go. And when I say cut, that means stop. Forgetting, of course, that he's spent a career in Hollywood.
Former
I caught
LA,
myself a moment later, but he wasn't mad at all. He looked at me with a twinkle in his eye and said, okay. As if he knew I was nervous and didn't have to prove to me how important he was.
Funny.
That told me a lot about him.
Great story about working with Ronald Reagan. Thank you for sharing that. Again, Mark Weaver was in the Reagan administration in the DOJ as a spokesman. Mark, earlier today, as another story I want to get into, is U.S. military has raised security protection measures that is taking at its basis throughout Europe, asking service members to be more vigilant and keep a lower profile due to a combination of threats it is seeing across the region. Story goes on to say, and this is from AP News, U.S. European Command said in a statement late yesterday, Sunday, that a variety, quote-unquote, a variety of factors play into the safety of U.S. military community abroad. And when I read that, I thought, whoa, time out here. I'm like questioning it. I just don't trust it. And it says, increasing threat level to Charlie, they call it, the second highest of the 5 levels of service members' threats, is a result of a combination of events occurring across Europe, including, they say, elections in France and in the UK, upcoming Olympics, and other major sporting events. There are no other major sporting events other than the Olympics upcoming, by the way. And it says, and the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza. And all I could think about with this, Mark, as I read that, and I saw several sources as I went to various different sites, and including military sites, none of that's changed. The only thing that's new in there is the Olympics. And that's not really that new. So why did the threat level go up? You worked in the DOJ, you worked in government. Are you as much questioning this as I am?
I am worried. I did have a top secret clearance at Justice. It was not for foreign policy matters. It was for more organized crime and criminal matters. But I will say this. I'm a keen observer of national security issues. And I can't help but wonder how many of our adversaries noticed how absolutely cognitively impaired Joe Biden was.
That's where I was going.
last week. Now, they certainly have known this. It's only people who have not been paying careful attention who were surprised last week when Joe Biden looked as out of it as he did. Anybody who's been paying attention should know this, and certainly spy agencies know this. Having said that, they know he's in a time of disarray. They know that the president is losing his base, voters who want him to be swapped out for somebody else. That is a time of great confusion and disarray, and that is when foreign actors are likely to act. And they didn't do it when Trump was president because they couldn't quite figure out what he might do. But they know that Joe Biden is largely feckless and largely unable or unwilling to enforce any of the claims he's made about American power or coming to the aid of our allies.
My opinion is very similar to that, Mark. I think if Biden, the debate the other night, if Joe Biden had been very presidential and Joe Biden from 25 years ago, on point, not stuttering, finished his sentences, well thought out, that threat level would not have increased yesterday or today. It would not have increased. I think that's purely on Joe Biden and the geopolitical forces going on in this country and the division between the parties and the angst going on across all levels of government. I think that's what that has to do with. That's a fair statement. Would you agree?
I do. I think that's a great concern. All of us as Americans, listen, we for those of us who are Christians, we are called to pray for our leaders, and I regularly pray for our leaders. And so I want what's best for our leaders, but also what's best for our country. But we have to be honest with ourselves. The man that our country elected legitimately, I think, as our president, he was legally elected as our president, is simply not up to the task. Other people are making decisions. This is a dangerous time in a dangerous world, and I worry for our country.
That's Mark Weaver. He's a professor of constitutional law at universities across the country. He's written a wonderful book. If you're looking for a great read, it's called A Wordsmith's Work. It is it's 3 decades of writing on persuading, informing, and amusing people in public life. Leaders get it right many times, and sometimes they get it wrong. He talks about those. Reagan's quoted in this as well as others. It's a wonderful read. A Wordsmith's Work. You can find that on Amazon. I highly encourage you, if you're a reader, to check it out and get yourself a copy of that. He also penned an op-ed today in Newsweek magazine, which you will see in your upcoming issue of Newsweek. Mark, bottom of the hour here, I've got coming up in 2 minutes. Sean Allen in the newsroom is going to be doing a story about 4th of July fireworks celebrations, but really also Biden's reaction to the ruling on the Supreme Court. He's got some audio on that. And on the other side of his newscast, I want to talk a little more about the Supreme Court ruling again and Joe Biden's response and the Democratic Party's response and how this plays out to the weakness of our geopolitical system. We'll talk about that right after the news, which is coming up in 2 minutes. That's Mark Weaver. I'm Westside Jeff, and for Chris Kroc on News Talk 820 WBAP and now on FM at 93.3. Westside Jeff is the name, sitting in for Chris Kroc. Chris has taken the week off. He's back next Monday. I'll be back tomorrow night and Friday night. Joining me tonight, Mark Weaver. He is a constitutional he's an attorney who teaches constitutional law. He teaches at the Ohio State University Law School and Columbus, Ohio School of Government at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's also an author of a wonderful book called A Wordsmith's Work, and today he penned a great article, op-ed, for Newsweek magazine. You can see it at Newsweek magazine's website and in their publication about today's Supreme Court ruling with regard to presidential immunity. Mark, thanks for sticking around. You heard a moment ago Sean Allen in our newscast play an audio clip from the president, Joe Biden. He came out the White House tonight, and it was a very controlled atmosphere. He had a podium, so it covered up his inadequacies. He had a teleprompter, and he looked like the Joe Biden we've seen, as opposed to Joe Biden the other night at the debate performance. They followed up with a tweet after that, and one of the tweets from Joe Biden today was, "I will respect the limits of presidential powers that I have that I have for 3.5 years, but any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law. I concur with what Justice Sotomayor wrote today. With fear for democracy, I dissent. So do I." What strikes me about today's ruling and about that, in my lifetime, Mark, usually when a president comments about something around the Supreme Court and a ruling, they don't invoke their opponent's name. That's all Joe's doing. He's making it all Donald Trump. Mark, you own a company called Communications Council. You're a political consultant. You strategize with politicians on that. You also teach constitutional law. You've got to have some strong opinions on what went down today on both sides, from a politician standpoint, from a PR standpoint, from the office of the presidency standpoint, but also from a political consultant standpoint. Where's your head at with all this?
This was a campaign speech by Joe Biden. It was covered greatly because everyone wanted to see whether he would put in the bad performance he put in the other night. But listen, when he's controlled and when it's only for a few minutes and when he has a teleprompter, he can do a fair job. It's when he has any stress, whether he has to talk off the top of his head or whether for it's more than a few moments, is when he short circuits. And it was just, even if he didn't have the cognitive problem, this was a shame, attacking the Supreme Court. Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the authors of the Federalist paper, and I talk about this in my Newsweek op-ed, which you can see on my Twitter feed at Mark R. Weaver and my X feed at Mark R. Weaver. Hamilton worried that the judicial branch that didn't have a sword, it didn't have a shield, it didn't have the power of the purse, that it was easily beat up on by the other branches. And Hamilton said in Federalist 78 that it would look to the executive to help defend its efficacy. Well, that's the exact opposite of what happened today. The executive, the president, is actually bullying the Supreme Court and using the power of his bully pulpit and enacted what I would call political thuggery to undermine the credibility of the high court. And it's despicable.
And he's weaponizing our law enforcement based off policy, right? Would you agree with that?
Sure. Well, we talked about that previously by going after Donald Trump and by taking the number 3 Biden appointee at the Justice Department and sending him to New York City to be a state prosecutor for a little while, just enough to prosecute Donald Trump. So the Biden administration has done a lot to undermine the rule of law, to weaponize the justice system, and to really do what so many people criticize and accuse Donald Trump of doing, which is breaking long-standing norms. It's the notion of, or as Joe Biden would have said the other night, the idea of criticizing the Supreme Court in the fashion that Joe Biden has really goes against American tradition.
I saw, Mark, earlier today several tweets on X following the Supreme Court ruling that had the concept, the idea, the notion, several posts drawing a connection between today's ruling about presidential immunity and Watergate, saying under this ruling, Nixon did nothing wrong. Talk a little bit about that.
No, that's not true. First of all, to the extent that any president commits a crime personally in his personal capacity, he could absolutely be prosecuted. And if he commits a crime in his official capacity, the burden against prosecution can be overcome. That's where everyone's being slippery right now. They're making it seem as though the Supreme Court today said no president can ever be prosecuted for official action. No, they simply said the burden is that the president does have immunity, but under the proper facts, that immunity can be undone, and that would have happened in Watergate example you gave.
Where do you think, Mark, we sit on the ruling of the presidential immunity in this case today as we saw it? Where do you think we sit with that ruling and where it goes 60, 90, 120 days down the road from here?
Well, if the president's lawyers, if Donald Trump's lawyers have not already filed additional appeals in every one of his cases, including trying to forestall the sentencing on July 11th, if they haven't done it already, then they'll certainly do it soon, because in every instance, these allegations of what Donald Trump did or didn't do happened while he was president. And as a result, there does have to be a hearing to sort out what is official conduct and what is not official conduct. Yeah, I think it's least applicable to the New York case and most applicable to the Washington, D.C. case. But in all the cases, the judges will have to reckon with what the highest court in the land said today.
You're a political consultant and you do a lot of political campaigns. You don't handle the Trump campaign or the Biden campaign. You obviously handle stuff on the Republican side of the aisle. The case that went down today and some of the other rulings, Supreme Court rulings, and the fallout from the debate. You're a political consultant. Which of these issues, do you think any of these issues are sticky enough to impact the election, impact the election?
The two most important factors that will decide this election is, number one, the economy / border. They are connected, of course. The open border and the horrific Biden economy. That's factor one. Factor two is whether or not Joe Biden is competent to make it through another term. And factor two was kind of off in the distance up until last week. And it went from being an issue on the horizon to an issue right up to our nose because we couldn't avoid seeing it. Right. Those two issues is what are the key fulcrums that will decide this election in November.
On the other side, I got to hit a break. On the other side of this, I want to continue a conversation with you with regard to your political consultant on the heels of today. What if you're handling the Trump campaign? What advice are you giving him? What actions are you moving forward on to get him elected? And on the other hand, what would you do for Joe Biden if you were coaching him, and how you would direct him as his political consultant? Think about that. I want to hit the other side of that. Hit that on the other side of the quick break, and we'll be back in about 3.5 minutes. That's Mark Weaver. I'm Westside Jeff, and for Chris Crock on News Talk 820, WBAP, and now on FM at 93.3. I was just ducking out real quick and talking to Sean Allen in our newsroom about what he's got coming up top of the hour, and he's got a story about FEMA extending assistance to local residents affected by May storms. We got drilled here in North Texas with record rainfalls. I mean, we got 3 or 4 months worth of rain in some of the areas that some homeowners had significant damage. And FEMA has extended assistance to residents. He's got a story on that. If you haven't filed, he'll tell you more about that. The other thing is, he told me that the GOP is suing Merrick Garland. Certainly some of the issues that Sean will have up in about 12 minutes. I'm Westside Jeff. Joining me is Mark Weaver. Mark, we've talked about a lot of big stories tonight. It's a very, very busy, significant news cycle at a time that a lot of news consumers aren't paying attention because it's a holiday week. It's summer vacations. It's 4th of July. It's really more important than ever before to stay news aware of what's going on. Of the stories that we've talked about from last Thursday today, Mark, what's the most significant story in your mind that will continue to be a story we'll talk about tomorrow, next week, next month, and for months to come?
To me, it is whether or not we can feel safe in our cities with the attack that's constantly happening on police and the refusal of some big city district attorneys to enforce the law. It affects every one of us every day. We're out and about, whether we're pumping gas, going downtown for work, going out for a restaurant. Our prices are higher because shoplifting goes unprosecuted. Our children and our loved ones are at risk when they go out in a place where they can be assaulted. And as long as the left continues its war on police and its war on prosecutors, we will not be safe. To me, that is the issue that domestically matters the most, compounded by the border and criminals coming across with fentanyl and human trafficking. So those issues are connected. But to me, that is much more important than whatever's happening in Ukraine or even in Gaza, both of which are horrific in their own respects.
You have a political consultancy, an agency that you consult a lot of political candidates. I think the only race you've not handled is a presidential race. Am I right on that? You do U.S. Senate.
Well, we've done super PAC and third-party stuff, but we actually have never done the official race for a presidential candidate. That's
but
true.
you do Senate races, you do congressional races, you do certainly gubernatorial and other state races too. But you're across the whole country, including here in Texas. As a political consultant on the Republican side of the aisle, let's talk about this. Let's hypothetically, you're Donald Trump's political consultant today. He brings you in and says, what do you think? What should I be doing? What kind of advice are you giving Donald Trump to win in November today?
More of the same. Steady as she goes. Do not go over the top. There's no reason to go over the top. Remind people how good things were when you were president. Stick to that. It's a winning message. Steady as she goes.
What do you expect to happen in the polls over the next couple weeks? My personal opinion is this, that Joe Biden is the worst president of my lifetime. He's done more damage to our country than I can remember. He was worse than Clinton, worse than Carter, than any of them. And the division he's created is horrible. He's just horrible. He's got to go. And under any normal circumstances, if we had a phenomenal, unbelievable candidate on the Republican side, I don't understand why Trump isn't ahead 70-30, because it's the worst president of my lifetime. How do you answer that?
Donald Trump is a unique personality. He's a disruptor.
Yep.
He makes the left furious.
Yep.
They're willing to part with lots of money and volunteer lots of their hours to stop him, because he really is shaking up the status quo, and that brings out division in our country. We've been divided for a while. It happened before Trump, but he is uniquely triggering some of these people, and so that's why they cling to Joe Biden, even though he is a flawed vehicle to advance their cause. He's the best vehicle they have right now, and that's what's keeping this race close.
Let's turn the attention towards this. You're a Republican consultant. You consult Republican candidates for a lot of offices. Let's assume that you're a Democratic operative. Let's assume you're Joe Biden's candidate, as a candidate, his political advertising shop. What he calls you at night, he's not going to call you at night because he's sleeping after about 8 o'clock because of sundowner disease and all. He asks for advice. What are you telling him?
I'd like to think I'd have the courage to tell him that for the good of the country, he needs to resign. But if he told me he really wanted to win, I would tell him that he has to stop being dishonest about his infirmities. He's got to own up to them. Everyone sees them. If he would acknowledge them, there might be more sympathy for him. But right now it just aggravates people when he says that he's perfectly fine, or when his supporters say that he's stronger than some 30-year-olds who can't keep up with him. It's all nonsense. It's balderdash. If he were to be more genuine and authentic, he'd win some more sympathy. But he's in a tough spot because he has to admit that he's not just somebody who experiences senior moments. He experiences full-blown senior hours.
And you think at this point that Joe Biden is the candidate on Election Day? He goes all the way through election, right?
I do. It's just too hard to remove him. He has to agree. And I don't think he will. I think he has been power mad since, remember, this man has been running for president since the 80s, and he's been running for office since the early 70s. He just cannot give up his grip on power.
Who has the power to convince him it's time to step down? Other than Jill
and Hunter. Jill and Hunter have the most influence from everything I've read. I've never met the person. I don't have any personal insight, but I read a lot of accounts. And by all the accounts I read, Jill and Hunter have the most influence in his world, but they also have the most to gain from him staying in power, because neither of them would be relevant but for him.
Something tells me Pelosi and Schumer may be called in on this, and they may be a part of it. Would you agree or disagree?
That's what happened, when Lyndon Johnson in 1968, Democrats went up to the White House and said, Mr. President, you can't win. You need to step aside and not run again. And Lyndon Johnson was one of the most power-mad presidents in the history of the Republic. And then that's what Republicans came up to the White House when Richard Nixon was president and said, you can't withstand an impeachment vote. And so you'd like to think that Chuck Schumer and the Nancy Pelosi would be the adults in the room. That has not been their style, though. Their MO has not been to be the adults in the room. It's been to throw gasoline on the far left flames. And so I'd be surprised, frankly, if they did it. Only if their members made them. If their Democratic House and Senate members forced them to do it, would they do it.
Mark, thanks for your time. I appreciate you joining me tonight. You've been a wonderful world of help. Check out Mark's book. It's a Wordsmith's Work on Amazon. I appreciate your time. I'll continue to talk to you along the way. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.